Good evening, everyone. Good evening from Bangkok. My name is Chontit Chunura, and I am the Director for the Office for the Bangkok Rules and Treatment of Offender at the Thailand Institute of Justice. And today I will serve as the moderator for this session. So first of all, I would like to welcome everyone from all over the world to join this special event on the 10th anniversary of the UN Bangkok Rules, Global Perspective and the Way Forward. As we know that this event is organized with the purpose to commemorate the 10th year of the Bangkok Rules. We hope to use this as an opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to enhance criminal justice system for women around the world. So this event is co-organized by Thailand Institute of Justice, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and Penal Reform International. So before we begin our session today, I would like to make a short housekeeping announcements. So first of all, this session is 45 minutes and it will be recorded so it can be shared and accessed by a larger audience later on. So due to the time constraints, we will not have a Q&A session, but you can see the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to use that and pose questions to specific panelists, and our panelists will answer your questions using that Q&A chat box. So during and after the session, if you wish to engage in our discussions, you can do so on the social media using hashtag Bangkok Rules or hashtag Bangkok Rule 10. So today we are having a great lineup of our speakers today from organizations that have played a key role in the developments, the drafting and negotiation process, and as well as the advocacies of the Bangkok Rules. To begin our sessions, it is our pleasure to have Ms. Gada Vali, Executive Directors of United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UN agency which acts as the custodians of the international standards and norms related to the treatments of prisoners, to deliver an opening remarks. So without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Vali. You may now have the floor.
Hello, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us to mark the 10th anniversary of the UN Bangkok Rules. I'm grateful to our partners at the Thailand Institute of Justice and Penal Reform International for co-organizing this event with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. While women and girls account for less than 7% of all people in prison, the female prison population has risen more than twice as fast as the male prison population over the past 2 decades. While women and girls account, in many countries, women prisoners are more likely than men to be first-time offenders imprisoned for non-violent offenses. However, penitentiary and criminal justice approaches are largely shaped by the needs of male offenders and prisoners with regard to prison regimes and healthcare, post-sentencing processes, and prisoner rehabilitation programs. As a result, women prisoners suffer worse outcomes in terms of their health and safety, their families and communities, and their chances of building a better future after they get out of prison. Gender-based discrimination in prisons and in criminal justice system hurts women and harms our societies. The adoption of the Bangkok Rules by the General Assembly stands as a milestone in the struggle to acknowledge and address this discrimination. The Bangkok Rules offer essential guidance on meeting gender-specific healthcare and mental healthcare requirements, as well as addressing substance abuse among women prisoners and providing gender-responsive HIV/AIDS prevention, treatment, and care. Crucially, the rules help to ensure the safety of women prisoners and to maintain their connection with their families. Guidance on the use of non-custodial measures also takes into consideration women's responsibilities as care providers for children and elderly family members. As the custodian of the Bangkok Rules and of related international standards and norms, UNODC is proud to work with countries to promote their full use and application as an important step towards creating more just and inclusive societies. Since 2010, our office has supported 30 member states through our global program on prison challenges and through field-based projects focusing on prison management, criminal justice, and prison reform, as well as social reintegration of women prisoners. With the support of the Thailand Institute of Justice, UNODC is currently implementing a project focused on gender-responsive non-custodial measures and social rehabilitation of women prisoners involving 9 countries in Asia. Moreover, we have developed a number of global tools to build the knowledge and skills of criminal justice practitioners and policymakers, including a commentary to the Bangkok Rules, a handbook and a training curriculum on women and imprisonment, and an e-learning course on alternative to imprisonment for women. Working with our partners at UN Women, UNDP, and OHCHR, we have published a practitioner's toolkit on women's access to justice programming. And together with the Thailand Institute of Justice, we have recently prepared a toolkit on gender-responsive non-custodial measures. To pilot the toolkit, we are currently conducting an online assessment of the use of non-custodial measures in Vietnam and Thailand. Through our technical assistance in the field and with a focus on social reintegration, we support the first project enabling women prisoners to access university studies in Panama, and we are providing vocational training in the construction sector to women prisoners in Bolivia under the UNODC Building Freedom Project. Furthermore, UNODC is scaling up skills building rehabilitation projects in Bolivia, El Salvador, Indonesia, Kyrgyzstan, and Namibia to benefit over 1,500 female prisoners in 5 years. Ladies and gentlemen, the use of gender-responsive non-custodial measures, as well as the treatment of women prisoners and their social reintegration, needs to be an integral part of the country's effort to build fairer and more resilient societies, as we strive to recover better from the COVID crisis. In a welcome development, in the spirit of the Bangkok Rules, we have seen a recent increase in the use of non-custodial measures to alleviate prison overcrowding and limit the spread of COVID, with many countries explicitly prioritizing the release of women held for minor offenses. UNODC remains fully engaged in supporting member states with the implementation of the Bangkok Rules in cooperation with civil society and other partners for the dignity and rights of women everywhere. I wish you fruitful discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wali, for the very informative message and inspiring message. And moving on, we now have a video statement from the Executive Director of the Thailand Institute of Justice, Dr. Kittipong Kittiarak, who has also played an important role as part of the delegations of Thailand during the drafting and negotiation process of the Bangkok Rules. And let's hear his words to commemorate these occasions right now.
Your Excellencies, Ms. Gada Wali, Executive Director of UNODC, Ms. Oliver Robe, Executive Director of PRI, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Bangkok. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to this online event to commemorate 10 years since the adoption of the historic United Nations rules on the treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders, also known as the Bangkok Rules. 21st December 2010 marked a milestone when, for the first time, the UN General Assembly officially recognized the gender-specific needs of women in the criminal justice system. As I look back at this journey, I am proud to recognize the role of Thailand in spearheading the adoption of the Bangkok Rules. Back in 2006, Her Royal Highness Princess Pacharakitayapar initiated the Kamlang Jai Project, or the Inspire Project, to provide support to women prisoners in Thailand, particularly pregnant women and children living with their mothers in prison. As a result of her passion for this issue, the project expanded across prisons in Thailand and gained significant momentum. Thailand presented the project at the 17th session of the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice in Vienna in 2008. That led to a long process of negotiation, after which the Bangkok Rules came into existence. A year later, in 2011, the Thailand Institute of Justice, or TIJ, was born, with the aim to promote and support activities related to the Bangkok Rules. At that time, there was very little awareness and discussion on the gender-specific needs of women in the criminal justice system in Southeast Asia. But since then, we have come a long way. In the past 10 years, discussion on women's specific needs in prison have become a greater part of mainstream dialogue. This has been a result of extensive research, capacity building, and advocacy on women's distinct needs. Research shows that what brings women into prison is greatly influenced by common factors, including economic situation, access to education, employment opportunities, mental health issues, and intimate partner relationships. With the disproportionate increase in women in prison globally, it has become evident that we need to look at female criminality not as the problem, but as a symptom of a much larger broken social structure, one that creates inequality and poverty that very often pushes women into offending. We need to address the root cause of such behavior instead of just the visible manifestation. And this will require a multi-sectoral collaboration and engagement. As we look towards the next 10 years, moving towards 2030, we will need to work together with governments, civil society, the private sector, NGOs, communities, and the women themselves to create meaningful criminal justice reform. We will need to provide a platform for women to tell their stories and empower their experience, since their voices are important input to gender-responsive policy formulation. We will need to look beyond prison and increase our efforts to implement the non-custodial sanctions and measures as a more effective way to rehabilitate and reintegrate women back into society. Finally, on the 10th anniversary of the Bangkok Rules, let us recommit to our joint efforts to enhance criminal justice system for women, and let us rethink how our responses to crime can truly create a safer society for all. Only then we will be one step closer to achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And only then will we be able to see a world where fewer women come into prisons, and the ones who do never return. Thank you.
Dr. Kittipong Kitayarak, the Executive Director of the Thailand Institute of Justice. So moving on to our presentation today, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have such a wonderful speaker with us today. I would like to say there are my dear colleagues and experts in this field who have been closely worked in terms of research, policy advocacies, and policy advocacies to promote the implementations of the Bangkok Rules around the world. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Catherine Hurd, Director of the Institute for Crimes and Justice Policy Research, or ICPR. Currently, she directs the World Prison Research Program, which provides comparative research on prisons and imprisonment, building on the work of ICPR's online database, the World Prison Brief, which provide details of the prison system of over 220 independent countries and dependent territories around the world. So today, Catherine will share about the trends in the imprisonment of women since the adoption of the Bangkok Rules. Catherine, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chontit, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you for the invitation. The Bangkok Rules came into force at a time of unprecedented growth in female incarceration rates. And although I was asked to present on what has happened to the female prison population since the introduction of the rules in 2010, I hope you'll allow me to place this in the context of what happened also in the 10 years up to that time. And because our World Prison Brief was launched 20 years ago, we're in a good position to offer you that longer view today. Many of you already know about the World Prison Brief, so I won't spend long on this slide, but I'd just like to say that we now hold data on the female prison populations of 221 countries and dependent territories globally. And those figures are updated very regularly on the website itself. Thank you. Next slide, please. So first, I'd like to talk about the global context. There are currently at least 11 million prisoners in the world, and that represents an increase of around 25% since 2000, more or less in line with the increase in national population levels. The prison overcrowding problem has increased though, and we now have over 60% of countries globally that run their prison systems over official capacity. As has been mentioned, there are just over 700,000 women and girls now in prison. The picture is very disparate across continents and countries, both in terms of rates and trends of female prisoners, which I'm going to talk about. But the big picture point is that there has been rapid growth in female imprisonment in much of the world in recent decades. Next slide, please. So first, I'd like to look at the position by continent over the last 2 decades. So this picture represents a summary of what has happened across the 5 continents and globally. And I think the standout point is that we've had overall an over 50% increase in prison population numbers since 2000. And that compares with the general global population, which went up by just over 20%. In terms of continents, you'll note that in Europe, that was the smallest increase, but please do also note that European prisoner numbers generally fell by 22% in this period. So it isn't great to see that the female prisoner numbers still continue to rise. But the really severe increases that we've seen were in 2 continents, Oceania, driven by New Zealand and Australia's high imprisonment rates over this time, and Asia. Now, if you could move to the next slide, I would like to remind you that the World Prison Brief has a highest to lowest function that allows you to see a range of rankings. This particular one shows the countries with the highest proportions of women in countries' prison populations. Now, next slide, please. We have here included countries that have very large prisoner populations and with the highest proportions of women in their incarceration population. So top of the list here, we have Hong Kong, which has a 20% proportion of women in custody. Next across is Thailand, and you can see the large number of Asian continent countries that have high proportions of women in their prison populations. Next slide, please. We're now going to take you through the 10 countries with the highest female prisoner numbers overall. So these 10 countries between them hold about 2/3 of all women prisoners in the world. And I would note actually that China, the total would be much larger if official figures included pre-trial detainees and administrative detainees, which are not data that the government publishes. So again, we have quite a large number of Asian continent countries here, but we also have Brazil, which has a very large number of female prisoners today. Next slide, please. So this slide shows you what changed between 2000 and the date of the Bangkok Rules coming in. Women prisoners are shown in blue on this chart, and all prisoners are shown in beige. And as you can see, there is an extraordinary rise in female prisoners in many countries in this group of 10. The figures speak for themselves. Only Thailand saw an increase in female prison populations over this time, as it did in its general prison population. Russia is an interesting one because, as you can see, whilst the female prison population shot up by 26%, the general prison population saw a decline of almost 20%. And it's also interesting to see that in almost all the countries here, the female increase outstrips the general increase by a really large margin. Next slide, please. So this is the picture since the Bangkok Rules came into force. And it is still a picture of rising prisoner numbers, unfortunately, in most of these 10 countries. But the picture is a little different. So first of all, I would like to point out that there's a very big increase in some countries, but the female increase generally no longer outstrips the general increase. It only does so in China, as it did in the previous decade. Sadly, Thailand no longer sees a decrease in incarceration numbers or in female prisoner numbers. Those numbers have gone up. The Russian Federation is the standout country here, which, as the US, did manage to turn around the juggernaut of mass incarceration over this decade, which was good to see. But there is the picture briefly since the Bangkok Rules came in. And next slide, please. So completing the picture, just a few discussion points, really, some final thoughts on what these numbers represent. Really rapid growth in female prisoner numbers since 2000 at a rate that generally more than twice outstrips the growth in the male prisoner population over this time. Since the Bangkok Rules came in, data from countries with the largest female prison populations do suggest that the numbers are still rising, but albeit at a slower pace than what we saw in the first decade of the millennium. The cause for concern I've mentioned across the Asian region, with very large gains seen in the Chinese, Indonesian and Philippine female prison populations. And sadly, the reductions achieved over the previous decade in Thailand unfortunately reversed, although a real note of optimism on that today with, as I saw an announcement of about 30,000 prisoner releases under the Royal Collective Amnesty. That should help in reducing serious overcrowding. The increases in the female prison population globally, as we know, is fueled in large part by the war on drugs. And as Dr. Kittipong mentioned also, there is a real problem of income inequality and social marginalization that drives much female offending. And we must recall that the vast majority of women in custody have not committed violent or serious offences. Given the high financial and social costs that female imprisonment carries, we really need to rethink its excessive use, because having so many women in prison doesn't contribute to public safety. The Bangkok Rules state and restate the key points from the Tokyo Rules, which is that, states have to foster the use of alternatives to imprisonment, and they must look for diversion away from criminal justice where possible altogether. So my closing thought is that in this age of budget cuts, and sadly, the first thing that's likely to be dropped will be things like rehabilitation schemes, restorative justice, and all these great non-custodial measures. And perhaps as we emerge from the pandemic next year into a global financial downturn, we really must look at more radical ways of cutting female prisoner numbers and ending our reliance on criminal justice altogether wherever we can. Now, the final slides are simply links to some of our work. I'm sure the slides will be available, but in the final slide, you'll see our website addresses for people wanting to visit the World Prison Brief, or indeed wanting to download any of our publications. But for now, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for a very useful presentations. And I think the World Prison Brief has been one of the most useful resources that criminologists around the world refer to. And thank you for giving us the overviews in terms of trends in the female imprisonment populations. And unfortunately, not a very good picture for Thailand, but still that would just imply that we still have a long way to go and more work needs to be done. And I think that brings us to the second speakers, who will focus a little more on the use of alternative to imprisonment for women's offenders. So for our next speaker, I would like to introduce Ms. Claudia Baroni. She is the Drugs Control and Crime Prevention Officer at the UNODC. And at UNODC, Claudia is responsible for the portfolio on genders and criminal justice, which includes strengthening crime prevention and criminal justice responses to violence against women, the treatment of women's prisoners and offenders, as well as the promotions of women as criminal justice officials. So today, Claudia will talk about promoting gender responsive, non-custodial measure and prison management. But before I pass the floor on to Claudia, I would like to remind us again, since we do not have sufficient time for the Q&A sessions, I would like to invite audience to post your questions using the Q&A box, and our panelists will answer that through the that Q&A sections. So the floor is now yours, Claudia. Thank you.
Many thanks, Chontit, and good afternoon, good evening, or good morning to all participants. I'm extremely honored to participate in this event to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the United Nations rules for the treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders, the so-called Bangkok Rules. And at the outset of my remarks, allow me a very personal memory and recall how the foundation for the adoption of these groundbreaking instruments were laid by the work of a small but very dedicated and passionate group of experts, some unfortunately no longer with us, which met in February 2009 under the auspices of the Ministry of Justice of Thailand. That meeting, in which I had the privilege and the fortune to participate, was the very first step that put in motion a process that brought finally more justice, fairness, and equality in the treatment of women prisoners and women offenders worldwide level. The rules are the only international instruments which focus specifically on women offenders and women prisoners, promoting a non-discriminative and substantive equality by taking into account and providing for their distinctive needs. From an historical perspective, actually, it's very interesting to notice how the Bangkok Rules represent a kind of turning point in the adoption of new crime prevention and criminal justice instruments by the international community. The two most relevant instruments which have been adopted after 2010, the United Nations Principles and Guidelines on Access to Legal Aid in Criminal Justice Systems, and the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, the so-called Nelson Mandela Rules, they have both taken a gender-responsive approach, while most, if not all, the United Nations standards and norms which have been adopted before 2010 were somehow gender-blind, non-gender responsive. As we know, women offenders tend to share certain characteristics. They usually commit non-violent offenses. Very often they have a history of victimization, drug use disorder, mental health issues, and the large majority of women offenders, they have childcare and family care responsibilities. The Bangkok Rules advocate that it is important for policymakers and for criminal justice professionals to recognize this common characteristic and understand the main drivers leading to women's imprisonment, together with the harmful impact that imprisonment may have on women. Non-custodial measures can help address women's specific needs and foster their reintegration process. However, it is important that those measures are truly gender responsive, as many of the existing non-custodial measures and sanctions overlook the typical characteristic roles and backgrounds of women in contact with the law. Mindful of all these considerations, throughout the past 10 years, UNODC has developed several tools to raise awareness on this issue and provide technical guidance to judges and prosecutors, as well as to other relevant criminal justice professionals working with women in the criminal justice system. For example, defense lawyers, probation officers, health professionals, and civil society organizations. The most recent one, which was also mentioned by our executive director, is the Toolkit on Gender Responsive Non-Custodial Measures, which have been jointly developed with the Thailand Institute of Justice and has been launched in June of this year. This toolkit provides support and guidance on ensuring that women in contact with the law are not detained or imprisoned unnecessarily, and that detention is used as a measure of last resort. The toolkit intends to support the criminal justice systems in identifying the specific needs of women in contact with the law, in ensuring gender equality in the application of non-custodial measures, and in addressing the specific and special needs of special categories of women, such as women survivors of gender-based violence, foreign national women, and women arrested for drug offenses. The toolkit is also meant to provide an insight for the media to better understand why it is important to develop gender-responsive non-custodial measures for women offenders. Throughout the years, UNODC has also provided technical support with different types of initiatives and activities to various countries worldwide in implementing prison management reforms in line with the Bangkok Rules, as was illustrated by our executive directors in their introductory remarks. In the past years, UNODC has also organized several training activities for prison staff and managers of prison for women. The last one was a training which was organized together with the Thailand Institute of Justice from Malang for staff of Malang prisons in Indonesia, which focused on the importance of safety, rehabilitation, and gender-sensitive health. The promotion of gender-sensitive health is indeed a crucial component of the Bangkok Rules. And in this regard, I wish to recall an important recent initiative which has been taken by our Office for Southern Africa, which is the development of a study guide on sexual and reproductive health and rights for women prisoners, which includes specific modules on sexual and reproductive health, prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV in prisons, tuberculosis care and treatment, human rights and gender-based violence, as well as managing of mental health issues in prisons. Up to date, around 700 prison officers from 7 countries of the Southern African region have been trained on this specific guide. The 10th year's anniversary of the Bangkok Rules offer a unique opportunity not only to celebrate together this important achievement, but also to assess and understand what are the main lessons that can be drawn from their implementation in order to better and more effectively address the challenges for the years ahead. The first lesson that can be drawn is that still many countries do not have legal and policy frameworks that recognize and meet the specific needs of women in contact with the law. Therefore, countries should ensure that the needs of women entering contact with the law are duly taken into consideration in any criminal justice reform process. Furthermore, countries should put more emphasis on trying to keep women out of the prison system in the first place and on developing gender-specific options for diversionary measures and pretrial and sentencing alternatives. In view of the characteristic that a large percentage of women offenders share, non-custodial measures should be preferred, especially for cases of women with children and other dependents. However, as it was already mentioned, those measures are rarely designed for or geared towards women. And therefore, countries must take any effort to develop non-custodial measures and sanctions that truly take into consideration the typical characteristics, roles, and background of women in contact with the law. The COVID-19 crisis has brought dramatic and devastating effects on different sectors of societies, including the prisons. The outbreak of the pandemic and the emergency that has followed has demonstrated that reducing prison populations without compromising public safety is possible. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, countries across the world have released significant numbers of prisoners to mitigate the risk and impact of the pandemic in prisons. Many of those countries have explicitly included women as a prioritized category of offenders for release, taking into account that the majority of women are behind bars for minor and non-violent offenses, and they do not pose a risk for society. Other countries, on the other hand, did not confer release upon women offenders based on their gender, but more on the sentence-based criteria to be applied generally. Further, it seems that women more often benefited from release measures when they were either pregnant, breastfeeding, or had an infant or young child in or outside the prison. However, the lack of disaggregated data makes it impossible to determine how many women have actually benefited from those emergency release measures. In the months ahead, it will be important to undertake further research on how countries have prioritized the release of women prisoners during the pandemic, so as to identify most promising practices to guide countries in ensuring a gender-responsive treatment of women offenders and prisoners in times of emergency situation like the current one. Another key priority for the years ahead is to ensure that women professionals, including those working in the prison systems, are available and have equal access to training and managerial position in a work environment which is free from discrimination and sexual harassment. Global data collected by UNODC on criminal justice personnel show that women are usually unrepresented within the criminal justice systems in most countries. Moreover, studies show that the effectiveness of women police stations and of increased representation of women in justice institutions more broadly. Adequate female representation among personnel can lower the risk of abuse or secondary victimization, including, for example, during the case of searches for women prisoners. The past years also teach us that it's crucial to invest in gathering and analyzing disaggregated data to understand the main drivers leading to women imprisonment and the impact of women's imprisonment in order to be able to develop and implement non-custodial measures and a prison management which are truly gender responsive. Finally, it would be important for countries to invest in raising awareness and developing informational and educational campaign so as to be able to convey the importance, the fairness, but also the cost effectiveness of having a gender responsive prison system, as well as using and applied gender responsive non-custodial measures for women offenders. I wish to conclude my remarks by recognizing the pivotal role that Thailand has had, not only in the adoption of the Bangkok Rules, but also in raising awareness on the instruments and in incessantly promoting their use and application in the past 10 years through the development of advocacy and capacity building material. Having Thailand championing this instrument has had a formidable impact on the implementation of the Bangkok Rules throughout the world. Many thanks for your kind attention and happy 10th anniversary to the Bangkok Rules.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for highlighting the work that has been achieved so far and also the way forward. As Claudia mentioned, there is a toolkit on the use of non-custodial measure for women's offender. For those who might find it interesting, you could go to the Q&A box and there is a link to that publication that Claudia has kindly mentioned. So moving on to our next speakers, I would like to introduce Ms. Olivia Rope, Executive Director of the Penal Reform International. PRI is a leading organization working in this field to promote criminal justice system that uphold human rights for all through advocacy on a range of human rights and criminal justice issues. So today, Olivia will focus her talk on the rehabilitation and social reintegrations of women's prisoners and also the way forward with the Bangkok Rules. Olivia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Shantit. I'm really honoured to be speaking today after many partners and colleagues as well, to mark the 10th anniversary, and thank you to the TIJ and UNODC for partnering on this event and all of our Bangkok Rules work. My organisation, Penal Reform International, we've been intensely involved in promoting and implementing the Bangkok Rules. And I think generally 10 years on from their adoption, we know that a lot has been done, but there is much more to do. And there's a lot to build on in doing this work. We've seen many efforts in all corners of the globe to improve the situation for women in criminal justice systems. And today I want to focus on the critical area of rehabilitation, which is really at the core of the Bangkok Rules and also other international standards like the Mandela Rules and the Tokyo Rules. The Mandela Rules, in fact, lay out the purpose of imprisonment as twofold. Firstly, to protect society, and connected to this, to reduce recidivism. But these purposes, or this dual purpose of imprisonment, can only be achieved if the time spent in prison is used to ensure that people leave prison less damaged and with skills and the tools to rebuild their life, often after quite a destructive time in prison, away from their families. And this is really the starting point, which is critical not just for the individual level, but because we know that recidivism is expensive and it greatly harms the communities and the societies that we live in. We've seen globally in recent decades that there has been a trend towards more rehabilitative approaches in all aspects of the prison regime, which of course is welcomed. But for women who constitute a small minority in prison systems, many of their needs, especially with regard to specific rehabilitation programs, had been somewhat overlooked, and therefore Bangkok Rules 29 and 40 are really key to addressing this gap. Women have faced specific challenges in accessing rehabilitation opportunities. Many that do exist are heavily gendered, and there's also a lot of specific challenges, unique ones that women face when they are released from prison. I want to share an anecdote to unpack some of those issues. So about 5 years ago, a colleague and I were invited to visit a prison estate in a country that has many positive and well-evidenced good practices when it comes to criminal justice. It was well-funded, staff were well-trained, and there was really excellent understanding of the human rights standards from the leadership right through to prison staff. Firstly, we visited the women's facility, and there we were told that the vocational work available, which is a critical part of rehabilitation, available for women was involved packing goods for hospitals, so sort of factory work. And there was also knitting available. But next we visited the men's facility, which was across the road. It was in a very rural area, and the prison facility had a large farm attached to it where the men could learn agriculture, carpentry, fishing, and lots of other skills. There was no intention to deprive women of equal rehabilitation programs, quite the opposite, but there was only a realization among staff of the inequality when we raised it. And I think this type of unconscious discrimination, or in some cases it is overt discrimination, we've seen in many places with regards to women's access to rehabilitation programs. It's really been a priority area for PRI. In Georgia, we've run a large program including counselling, a business startup empowerment project, and helped to establish a shelter for those released. In Kenya, we've worked with the probation service to adapt their work to be more effective and suitable for women. And together with the TIJ, we've produced comprehensive guidance on this topic. From our work and through much research, we've identified many challenges, and I want to share a few of these. Prison overcrowding has to be the primary challenge that I must mention first in developing rehabilitation programs. It affects men, women, and children. But in overstretched systems, we see that female prisons are usually not the first in line for any investment or initiative that is brought in. And few resources also mean that a one-size-fits-all approach impacts negatively on women whose individualized needs remain unmet. Secondly, we see that overly punitive approaches hinder rehabilitation efforts. So, for example, the use of solitary confinement, frequent lockdowns and transfers, and withdrawal of educational privileges, for example, can affect women disproportionately, as many have mental health conditions which lead to behaviour where they're subject to disciplinary measures. And of course, COVID has worsened this situation. Thirdly, while men and women have some overlapping factors in their pathways to prison, there are really unique factors for women, including gender-based violence, a high propensity to mental health conditions, and there's also differences, for example, in substance use. There's also less research on women in comparison to men, despite many of the efforts over the last 10 years, and this has been recognised also by some UN experts. There's also fewer women prisons, and when we come to rehabilitation programs, because they're smaller, there might be less financial resources, less physical space available for things like libraries, classrooms, and training workshops. And where women are held in wings attached to male prisons, security reasons may unreasonably be given as a reason to limit access to libraries, classrooms, workshops, and so on that are only available in the male area of the facility. And finally, a challenge that is very close to my heart is that despite the emergence of many new and innovative rehabilitation programs for women in prison, many of them remain heavily gendered. They often reflect their traditional role in society, covering domestic tasks, for example, for which they may already be skilled. The opportunities may serve only to equip them for the most low-paid jobs in the economy, reinforcing notions that they cannot compete with men in the workplace. And this further entrenches vulnerable women's reliance on men, potentially compounding existing histories of dependency and abuse. So to respond to some of these challenges, we developed 10 key principles for gender-sensitive rehabilitation programs in our guidance, which I'll share a link for shortly. To mention just a couple, first of all, rehabilitation should be part of a broader strategy. This would ensure adequate resources, equipment, staff, and also longer-term sustainability. Programs should be community and individual driven based on consultation with the women affected. They should be gender responsive but not discriminatory. The opportunities should be as broad and flexible as possible, countering gender stereotyping. And really importantly, they should be based on market needs. There are clear pathways for potential employment for women who are leaving prison. And so prisons need to periodically assess programs they're offered and see if they fit the profile of the women who are benefiting from them and are relevant to the job market. There are many, many good practices which we outline in our guidance and inspiring examples, including from TIJ and UNODC, which can provide models and ideas on how we can meet the rehabilitative and often complex and unique needs of women in criminal justice systems. Before concluding, and I have a couple of minutes, I'd like to add some reflections on the way forward as we take stock of 10 years of the Bangkok Rules. And really look ahead as to where do we go now to improve implementation of these special and important standards. We are marking this anniversary at a time of deep distress for the global prison population. COVID has brought many more restrictions, more difficulties, and overall more hardship to people detained and those left outside. There's definitely no sliding scale of suffering, but from colleagues and partners, we have had reports of women really suffering, going without sanitary pads because of restrictions, being excluded from release mechanisms, as Claudia mentioned. Women going weeks or months without seeing or speaking with their young children due to visitor bans and lockdowns. and the mental health crisis that was already existing in many women's prisons is worsening. So above all, this global pandemic has really brought to a head the urgent need to think about how our governments are using prisons as a response to crime, especially for women, as we are marking the Bangkok Rules. The growth, as described by Catherine, even in the last 10 years, in spite of the Bangkok Rules guidance on non-custodial alternatives, can only be described as destructive and alarming. And Dr. Kitty Pong rightly described the criminalization of women as a symptom of a much wider broken system. So PRI is really thinking that we need to go right back to the start of these women's pathways to prison. Petty offences, low-level drug-related crimes, crimes committed in a context of violence, poverty, discrimination, status offences like abortion and witchery should all be a new focus, a bolder focus of our work. After all, these are pushing the numbers up. And as part of this, sentencing needs to be overhauled to have a gender lens to make sure that it is more proportionate if indeed a sanction is necessary. These are the issues that we need to focus on to improve the system for women who in many cases sit on the line of victim and offender. We are really at a moment where we can rightly look back on the last 10 years and agree that there is more awareness, there is more gender responsive systems. There are many good practices, but we also need to recognise that this is not enough. There is a need for systemic change, which requires investment and leadership. And you can count on PRI to continue the fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. I think you have beautifully summarized our discussion today. And I think all the speakers that are here with us today has highlighted all the achievement that has been done in different parts of the world, all the investment, capacity building program and support that has been happening in so many places. But still, I think all speakers and for the audience as well, I think we know that there are still a long way to go. I think this event is only summarize what we have done in the first decades. There are still many more decades to go. And I think to make the Bangkok Rules into the realities that would require collaborations from all sectors, whether be the criminal justice officer, correctional officer, researcher, advocates, and a member of civil society international organization. So I think TIJ will continue to create this kind of platforms and build collaboration with several agencies around the world to promote the criminal justice system which are responsive to the needs of women. So our final words to close up this event is that I think this event is to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Bangkok Rules. And let us use this as the opportunity, not just to inspire each other, but also for us to think about our action, think about our strategy to promote the criminal justice system, which are much more sensitive for women. So hopefully you all who participate in our event today will learn and make use of some of the information that we have shared with you today. And I would like to continue to promote us to engage in this kind of discussion throughout December and perhaps up until 2011 and 21, sorry, I'm going back in time, and using the hashtag Bangkok Rules and hashtag Bangkok Rules 10 to continue to be part of the global discussions on the implementations of the Bangkok Rules. So also today's events which are recorded will be played and made available online on UNODC, TIJ and PRI social network, social media. And thank you again, everyone, all the panelists who are here with us, and thank all the participants in the different parts of the world. And I would like to end our seminar today, and have a good night from Bangkok. Bye.